So Caitlin Clark's injury is something that is going to massively affect the WNBA.
The WNBA has been shaken by Caitlin Clark's recent injury, and the concern goes far beyond the games she could miss. With a new collective bargaining agreement, CBA, on the horizon, many believe her absence could affect league momentum, television ratings, attendance, and even future financial negotiations. Some reports suggest there's growing concern around the league about the potential economic impact if Clark is sidelined for an extended period, making the timing especially significant. As discussions over players' salaries and revenue continue, many are wondering whether this injury could influence the WNBA's next CBA. What do you think? Will Caitlin Clark's injury have a meaningful impact on the league's upcoming negotiations? Share your predictions in the comments below.
Obviously, look, there's going to be financial impact in the teams for 2 weeks, but the long-term financial impact of this injury might actually be...
Let's break down why Caitlin Clark's quad injury has become such a major talking point across the WNBA. It's not just about her missing a couple of weeks, it's about the possible financial impact at a time when the league is preparing for important collective bargaining discussions. Many believe the timing couldn't be worse for players hoping to secure higher salaries and better revenue sharing. Clark is widely viewed as one of the league's biggest attractions, and her absence has raised concerns about attendance, television ratings, and overall revenue. One of the first effects was seen with the upcoming game between the Washington Mystics and the Indiana Fever. Expecting Clark to draw a massive crowd, the Mystics moved the game to a larger arena, increased promotional spending, and hired additional staff to handle the anticipated turnout. Her injury has now created uncertainty around whether those expectations and the financial boost they were counting on will be met.
Paying all this money, paying up for tickets, and at the end of the day, deciding to not go, all right? Calling the whole trip off.
However, Caitlin Clark is no longer available to play, and the impact was felt almost immediately. Reports indicate that ticket prices for the upcoming game dropped sharply, with many seats remaining unsold after fans who originally planned to watch Clark decided not to attend. Many people had bought tickets specifically to see her rather than simply to watch the Indiana Fever compete without their biggest star. That has forced WNBA executives to confront just how much influence one player can have on attendance and revenue. The situation has even been compared to the effect Lionel Messi has had on Major League Soccer, where his presence dramatically increases ticket demand, media attention, and overall business for the league. When Lionel Messi misses games for Inter Miami CF, fans often express frustration because many purchase tickets specifically to watch him play. In some cases, Major League Soccer clubs have offered benefits such as free tickets to future matches or other promotional compensation to maintain goodwill with supporters. The key argument is that MLS openly acknowledges Messi's enormous impact on attendance and revenue, building much of its current momentum around his star power. Critics argue that the WNBA has been slower to fully recognize the business influence of Caitlin Clark, even as her presence has consistently driven higher ticket sales, television audiences, and overall interest in the league.
In a split instance, all of it can change. If this injury does anything, it should be a wake-up call to the WNBA, the Players Association, the team owners, that just like that, all this fanfare, all this interest, all this newfound attention on the league can disappear.
For the past 2 years, WNBA leadership has promoted the league's growth as broad-based and sustainable, emphasizing rising interest in women's basketball and the contributions of players across the league. However, some critics argue that Caitlin Clark's injury could put those claims to the test. They believe the next couple of weeks will provide a clearer picture of how much attendance, television ratings, and overall fan engagement are driven by Clark's presence. If there's a noticeable decline while she is sidelined, it could reignite the debate over just how significant her impact is on the league's current popularity and financial momentum. Past television numbers suggest that games without Caitlin Clark have often drawn much smaller audiences, and critics believe her absence could once again highlight that gap. This is why some see her injury as especially significant with collective bargaining agreement, CBA, negotiations approaching. Players are expected to seek higher salaries, expanded charter flights, better housing allowances, childcare support, and larger rosters, pointing to the league's recent growth as justification. However, if attendance and TV ratings decline noticeably while Clark is sidelined, some believe team owners could use those numbers to argue that the league's current financial momentum depends heavily on one star, potentially making upcoming CBA negotiations even more challenging. Looking ahead to the next 2 weeks, some analysts believe that if attendance and TV ratings drop sharply without Caitlin Clark, team owners could point to those numbers during upcoming collective bargaining agreement (CBA) negotiations. The argument would be that if much of the league's recent growth depends on one player, committing to significantly higher long-term expenses becomes more difficult. Many players are expected to use record television audiences, sold-out arenas, and increased merchandise sales as evidence that the league can support better salaries and benefits. However, critics argue that if Clark's absence reveals a major decline in fan interest, that negotiating leverage could weaken. Recent games featuring Clark have frequently attracted audiences in the range of 1.5 to 2 million viewers, making her impact on television ratings a central part of the discussion about the league's future economics. When Caitlin Clark isn't on the court, some analysts argue that television audiences can fall significantly compared with games she plays, raising questions about how much of the league's recent surge is tied to one star. They also point to attendance, noting that Indiana Fever games often sell out large arenas, while many other WNBA games attract much smaller crowds. Clark's road appearances have regularly boosted ticket demand, with opposing teams moving games to larger venues and seeing strong sales. Critics argue that if attendance and ratings decline noticeably during her absence, it could complicate upcoming collective bargaining agreement (CBA) negotiations. They contend that team owners may question whether the league can support significantly higher salaries, expanded charter flights, and additional player benefits if a large share of recent revenue growth appears to depend on the drawing power of a single player, according to some analysts and commentators. Certain team owners may view these 2 weeks as an opportunity to better understand how much the league's attendance and TV ratings depend on Caitlin Clark. If there's a significant decline in fan interest during her absence, those numbers could become part of the discussion in upcoming collective bargaining agreement (CBA) negotiations. From a business perspective, critics argue that lower attendance and ratings could strengthen owners' arguments for taking a more cautious approach to player salaries and benefits, while the Players Association is likely to emphasize the league's broader long-term growth rather than the impact of any single player from a business perspective. Some commentators argue that team owners may be hesitant to commit to major long-term salary increases if they believe a large share of the league's current revenue depends on Caitlin Clark. Their concern is about sustainability. What happens if Clark is sidelined for an extended period, retires, or is no longer the league's primary draw? Critics suggest owners would naturally try to control costs until they are confident that revenue growth is supported by multiple sources rather than a single star. They also argue that the long-term health of the WNBA depends on building a broader fan base and creating lasting financial stability beyond any one player. From that perspective, many observers believe it is in the league's and the players' best interest for Clark to remain healthy and continue contributing to the WNBA's growth for years to come. The financial future of many players is closely tied to Caitlin Clark's continued success, according to some commentators. They argue that if Clark were to suffer repeated injuries, see her popularity decline, or leave the league, the WNBA's recent financial momentum could slow significantly. At the same time, players could make the opposite case during CBA negotiations, arguing that the league should invest more in salaries and marketing to help develop multiple stars rather than relying so heavily on one player. However, critics note that this argument also highlights a potential concern that the league's current growth may not yet be fully diversified. While emerging stars such as Paige Bueckers and Angel Reese have built large followings, many observers believe Clark currently drives the highest levels of television viewership, ticket demand, and media attention, making her influence a central topic in discussions about the WNBA's long-term business strategy. Some commentators argue that Angel Reese generates much of her attention through her public profile and social media presence in addition to her play on the court, while others believe her basketball performance is also a major part of her appeal. They also point out that stars such as Sabrina Ionescu, Brianna Stewart, and Aja Wilson are widely respected for their talent and accomplishments, but have not consistently produced the same level of ticket demand or television ratings as Caitlin Clark. As a result, some analysts argue that if attendance and viewership remain heavily tied to Clark's presence, team owners could enter future contract negotiations with greater leverage by pointing to the league's reliance on a single player to drive much of its commercial success. Team owners could argue that if only a small number of players are driving a significant share of the league's revenue growth, there is less financial justification for large salary increases across the board. While that viewpoint is debated, some analysts say it reflects the business realities of professional sports, where compensation is often tied to revenue generation. The timing of Caitlin Clark's injury has therefore drawn extra attention because it comes just before what many expect to be the most important collective bargaining agreement, CBA, negotiations in WNBA history. Many players were expected to point to the league's strong attendance, television ratings, and commercial growth this season as evidence that higher salaries and improved benefits are financially justified. However, critics argue that this case becomes much harder to make if the next 2 weeks suggest that a large share of the league's recent success is tied primarily to Caitlin Clark. They believe such a scenario could weaken the players' negotiating position by raising questions about how broad and sustainable the league's growth really is. Beyond the financial side, there is also a psychological impact. Many players have embraced the WNBA's recent surge in popularity as a sign that the league is finally receiving the recognition it deserves, but Clark's injury is a reminder of how quickly momentum can change. It may also prompt renewed discussions about the financial health of WNBA franchises, many of which have only recently begun seeing stronger business results after years of operating with limited profitability. However, if much of the league's recent growth proves to be closely tied to Caitlin Clark, some analysts believe team owners will be cautious about making major long-term financial commitments. From that perspective, Clark's injury could provide additional data for upcoming collective bargaining agreement, CBA, negotiations, allowing owners to argue that the league needs multiple consistent stars before significantly increasing salaries and benefits across the board. On the other hand, if attendance and television ratings remain strong while Clark is sidelined, players could point to that as evidence that the WNBA's growth is broader and more sustainable than critics claim, helping strengthen their position in negotiations over the league's financial future. If attendance and television ratings decline during Caitlin Clark's absence, some analysts believe players could enter collective bargaining agreement, CBA, negotiations in a weaker position than they had expected. The discussion is made even more complex by the fact that Clark herself is playing under the WNBA's rookie-scale contract system, meaning her current salary is far below what many believe her commercial impact would command in an open market. Meanwhile, the league's recent growth has benefited many players through increased exposure and revenue opportunities, regardless of who directly drove that growth. As a result, some commentators argue that Clark's injury could have a greater effect on other players' future earning potential than on her own, since her contract is already set while many veterans were counting on the league's recent momentum to strengthen their case for higher salaries and improved benefits in the next CBA negotiations. If the league's recent growth proves difficult to sustain, some analysts believe the players' negotiating position could weaken considerably. That has also fueled a broader debate about the WNBA's future. Can it grow into a league driven by multiple marquee stars, or will it continue to depend heavily on Caitlin Clark as its biggest commercial draw? Critics argue that relying too much on one player makes long-term financial planning more challenging for both team owners and players. From that perspective, Clark's injury has arrived at a particularly sensitive moment, just as collective bargaining agreement, CBA, negotiations are approaching. Some believe players who were hoping the league's recent momentum would strengthen their case for life-changing salary increases and expanded benefits now face greater uncertainty if attendance and television ratings decline during her absence. The next 2 weeks could play an important role in shaping the tone of the upcoming collective bargaining agreement, CBA, negotiations. Some analysts believe the league will either strengthen or weaken the players' bargaining position depending on how attendance and television ratings hold up during Caitlin Clark's absence, with early speculation suggesting the latter could be a concern. If that happens, players may find it more difficult to secure the major salary increases and expanded benefits they have been seeking. While it remains too early to know the full impact, Clark's injury has intensified the debate over the WNBA's financial future and the league's reliance on its biggest star. What do you think will happen next? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more WNBA news and financial analysis.